Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Uniting for Workplace Parity. It's a partnered effort between the Employee Rights Center and the Kim Center for Social Balance. I'm Dr. Hei-ock, Executive Director of the Kim Center. We're a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating workplace equity for all employees through collaborative effort. Our LEAPS initiative unites communities around a structured program of rigorous assessment, targeted action, and standardized accountability. With me, I just want to take a moment to thank Alor Calderon and the Employee Rights Center for hosting this series. Jumping in. So, research tells us that widespread cultural transformation requires united community effort. However, before we get to solutions, leaders have to agree on how they will generate change together. Today is the final episode of our three-part series on getting legislators and employers to talk meaningfully about driving real progress together. I'm excited to introduce our panelists today, each of whom is well-versed in the interests of employer, government, and worker. I'll start with Barbara. Barbara Bree is a technology entrepreneur, former San Diego City Council member, and founder of 3 organizations that empower women: Athena San Diego, Run Women Run, and the Workplace Equity and Civility Initiative. Barbara also writes a regular column on entrepreneurship for the San Diego Union Tribune. Former California State Senator Hannah-Beth Jackson is principal at Hannah-Beth Jackson and Associates, focusing on consulting and strategic planning. She's nationally recognized for blazing new trails in American politics and shifting California's workplace culture as a champion for women's equality. Carol Kim is political director for San Diego's Building and Construction Trades Council and director of community engagement for the Trade Council's Family Housing Corporation. Her career spans teaching, research, politics, and advocacy. Carol serves on numerous boards, including Run Women Run and San Diego Workforce Partnership. And Andrew Strong is director of the Office of Equity and Racial Justice at the County of San Diego. He's deeply familiar with the county as an employer, having previously served in HR, finance, operations, and as chief of staff to the chief administrative officer. Andrew also serves as a commissioner for the city of Chula Vista. So, women still have second-class status in the workplace and in society. As a result, we live in a culture that normalizes lower recognition, respect, and reward for women than for men. We must intentionally rebuild our workplace culture so everyone receives the fair opportunities to succeed that they deserve. Employers need to systematically address entrenched policies and practices that unfairly disadvantage women if they want to stay competitive and thrive in the current market. But what is the best way to ally employers in the cause while making sure they're making measurable progress? Recently, legislators proposed the bill AB 1192 to require California employers with more than 1,000 employees to publicly disclose statistics regarding their human capital, such as pay, benefits, etc., so that we can track progress according to standardized metrics. It met with significant disapproval from the business community, particularly the California Chamber of Commerce. In the last 2 months, in this series, we've heard from employers and legislators separately about what it will take to collaborate toward true cultural transformation. Today, we're excited to bring you panelists who understand both sides of the coin for some concrete brainstorming. So Barbara, I'm going to start with you. Early in this series, both employers and legislators stated that lacking a clear definition of workplace equity is an obstacle to progress. Can you set the stage for us by describing how you would describe workplace equity?
Thank you, Hei-ock, and thank you for putting on this important program today. So I believe that workplace equity starts with employers recognizing that the internal culture we create drives the collective success of our community and that sexual harassment and gender discrimination negatively impact organizations, employees, and their families. An employer takes deliberate action to foster equity and create a positive workplace, a workplace that is free of sexual harassment and gender and discrimination. This can include policies that promote pay equity, or respectful workforce speech, language, and conduct, environments where employees feel safe to speak and report concerns, education for all employees, and measurable strategies to evaluate the education's effectiveness, positive engagement from employees regarding these issues, and most importantly, that the organization holds itself accountable. That means collecting data. If you can't measure it, it won't happen. The Workplace Equity and Civility Initiative, which is now managed by Lawyers Club of San Diego, invites employers and employees to sign a pledge, which we call a code of conduct, committing to the principles that I just outlined.
Thank you, Barbara, for that 360 perspective on it. Would anyone else like to add?
I think that's it's pretty thorough. Of course, part of the challenge is getting everyone to agree on what those items, what those values should be, and how, measuring them, and then what you do with the measurement. Accountability is critical, but companies tend to be resistant when it comes to publicizing or being exposed for what those policies may be. So that creates that tension right up front as you attempt to reach the consensus on what it is that we need to measure.
Yeah, Hannah-Beth is absolutely correct. But what I think, I think COVID is changing a lot of the way the workforce has operated and is going to continue to operate. And we've seen a record number of employees quit jobs without having another job. And employers that take seriously having an equitable workplace are going to have a leg up in both attracting and retaining good people.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I very much appreciate those comments. You're absolutely right. I think one of the biggest issues and the challenges is defining equity and having people understand what it is, right? Because there's few definitions about equity and what equity really is. But I think people have a misunderstanding that it might be equality, or it might be a little closer to equality than what equity truly is. And one of the things we're actually working on at the County of San Diego is actually making sure, sorry about that, is actually making sure we're looking at it in a different way, a different light, through Equity 2.0 that we're working with the Othering and Belonging Institute out of UC Berkeley with. And it's really about this concept called targeted universalism, where you're setting universal goals, right? But you understand people are situated differently within these structures and they need different things to achieve those goals, right? So understanding how you define that clearly for your organization, but also practicing that and having practical ways to practice that within your organizations is critical.
I just want to note too that when we're talking about how equity is achieved, I think we have to look beyond just the particular groups or buckets of people and that kind of thing. We also have to be really kind of honing in on the fact that those people also have to have a voice and power, right, inside those spaces. And if they are represented, but not actually able to have some sort of influence in that space, then the equity concern is not being met. So, for us, especially from the labor perspective, of course, we believe that collective bargaining agreements are really great for this because we actually are able to have that process built into our contracts and the way we engage with our employers. But and specifically, we have said in the past, and it's been said and continues to be said that, collective bargaining agreements are one of the great tools for creating equity inside a workplace. But these are the things that we often overlook when we talk about equity, is the fact that it's not just about having people in the spaces, it's about making sure those people are empowered in those spaces as well.
Yeah, I think all of your comments really drive home the fact that equity isn't one thing. It is a multifaceted, multi-layered, actually a tool, right? It is, as in finance, it's a process of getting to equal, where everybody has equal status and therefore receives the treatment that they deserve. This kind of leads us into our next question. because now we're talking about how does legislation further the goals of equity, inclusive diversity, et cetera. And if you could take a moment from the employer's side to think about the fact that legislators point out that it's their job to protect their constituents when employers don't see the injustices their employees face, but employers feel that they're being over legislated. It says you can't punish people for doing what you tell them to do. So if you tell them to disclose and then they get lawsuits, how should the law promote workplace equity? Let's start with Hannah-Beth.
Sure. Well, first of all, you have to recognize that the interests of a legislator to create public policy to reflect the needs of his or her constituents is very different than the incentives and the values of and the motivations of a corporation, a company. Their reason for being, their function, their purpose, their goal is to maximize profits. Now, those aren't in too many ways connected. As Barbara pointed out, yes, in today's world, as we're seeing more people leaving the workforce because they don't want to deal with the conditions at their employment, whether it's lousy pay or being forced into engaging in activities when they feel their health would be threatened, or the lack of childcare. They have no place to leave their kids in a safe situation while they have to go off to work. Whatever it is, that isn't the ostensible concern of a business. The business wants to make as much money as it can. Profit is what drives it. For a public policymaker, for a legislator, it's our responsibility to meet the needs and the values of our constituents. And so here's where the real challenge is. The notion that companies are afraid of getting sued. We hear this all the time. Therefore, we shouldn't pass laws. But a right that an employee has without a remedy is really no right at all. And so what we need to do, and you talk about this, is we need to get everyone at the table together. And this is the way I did a lot of the legislation I wrote, which, the chamber hated, job killers. I was very proud to have as many job killer bills as I had, because that told me that what we were doing was trying to get some control over the way businesses conduct themselves vis-a-vis their employees in particular, and perhaps even their consumers. So what is important is you put an employer, you put the companies in the room with the legislators and the interest groups, if you will, the employees or women who are needing childcare, or to try to gain equity. When you acknowledge equity isn't just the same exact thing for everybody, that you have to take into account their various own situations. And as a legislator, what you do is you say, look, this is my goal. I want greater equity, greater parity, safer workforce, all of these things. This is what I'm looking for in my legislation. Help me get there. Mm-hmm. Help me get to that goal in a way that also helps you, or at least creates the least series of difficult challenges. Let's work together. But at the end of the day, it's the legislator's responsibility in a democracy to reflect the values and the interests of her or his constituents.
Thank you, Hannah-Beth. Barbara, you look like you may want to jump in.
Yeah, I think Hannah-Beth expressed the goal of the legislature really well. It's to, and I just want to sort of say it back in a few different words. It's really to think about what's best for all of us. So is it best for all of us that women have half the board seats on public companies in California? Yes, it will be best for all of us, because studies have shown that when you have diverse voices at the table, companies are more profitable. So if we create equitable workplaces and have some legislation that moves us further down that road, companies will have an easier time recruiting and retaining talent. So I think that's part of thinking about what's best for all of us. And that's what legislators do.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up that business case to really drive home that this is best for all of us. not just one group or another.
And I want to thank you too, Barbara, because you're referencing my legislation,
Yes, I
which has raised the hackles of many, although not a single California company has challenged that law as a matter of interest. It's really coming from the right wing, which doesn't want any regulation or any government interference in the way they run their companies. So, but you're absolutely right. The data is all there. But sometimes, when you try to bring people to that resolution, we have biases that are also difficult to overcome, and you can't ignore those.
Yeah. Carol?
I think that and I think Barbara and Hannah-Beth have already touched on this, but really the point of the legislation is obviously to create an external force that drives change, because sometimes it does require that sort of pressure, especially when systems are sort of self-contained, as it were. And so we need to have these opportunities through our legislation. That said, I don't think anybody benefits by creating systems that just punish people without giving them an opportunity to make the changes constructively. So these are the things that can be built into legislation and often are. I mean, we can look at labor law for lots of different ways. Things can be tiered in, things can, people can be definite things can be phased. There are opportunities to make corrections as we go, but it is really important to realize that, there's a reason that things have been the same for a very long time. And it's because it is hard to change. So the legislation has to act on us sometimes to get us to move. And that kind of pressure, while it feels uncomfortable, can really result in a net positive for everybody, which is the thing that we all should be taking away here.
I think the hard to change that Carol said is really, really important. One large private employer in San Diego, I asked them, what is your biggest challenge? And this was pre-pandemic. And they said childcare. And I said, well, you're a big company. You could afford to offer childcare on site or subsidize it. They said, no, we really can't, because it's fair to some employees, but not fair to others. We really think this is something government should play a role in, and we would then contribute our fair share. And I thought that was fascinating. And what legislation can do is sort of create a level playing field so that everybody's going to have to play by the same rules. And this large company said they would be happy to pay their fair share into sort of a pot for childcare, but they felt it was inappropriate for them to do it on their own.
Interesting. Well, there are things that they could do without taking into account that some people will use it and some won't. For example, I have tried to encourage companies as part of their plant, part of their infrastructure, to create on-site childcare. Mm-hmm. And I actually did legislation that would have incentivized, not huge amounts of money, but sort of given gold stars, if you will, with small stipends or tax breaks for actually having on-site childcare. And of course, going with that too is the whole question of family leave, because whether or not you have children, you may have parents or loved ones who at some point in time are going to need your care. So it's really a sort of a democratic with a small d process of recognizing that workers have needs, whether it's with children or parents or themselves, particularly during the COVID crisis, that companies really, and this is one of the things, how do we get companies to recognize it's clearly in their best interest to provide this kind of opportunity for their employees so they don't come to work sick and infect everybody else that closes the plant or closes the business. But getting there, as you say, Carol, you're right, change is hard. Mm-hmm. Change is hard. People, that's the statement, better than the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Even if that devil isn't the devil at all. It's just it's hard for people to really stick their necks out, and companies to do that for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, one of the reasons is because you're talking about people's moral beliefs, their hearts, their minds. You're talking about structures that have been built over time, systems that have been built that may be inherently racist or discriminatory that we're talking about changing, right? And you're talking about, that's why I think it's really important when you're talking about legislation and our leaders taking the lead and putting out that legislation and putting that pressure that you mentioned, Carol, is very important. But it's also important to realize that within organizations and implementing those actions, you're even more so dealing with people's hearts, minds. You're talking about pocketbooks, right, within these organizations. So it's very, very tough change.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Well, so speaking of legislation as a driver of change when things aren't happening organically, so some employers say that state standardized data collection, for example, as Barbara was saying, you can't change what you can't measure. But if they feel that the data collection skews how their cultures really look, since it is just a two-dimensional process, let's be honest. But if these companies are national or global, for example, what kind of data do you think employers and legislators can agree should be collected to ensure measurable change in a way that feels standardized? Because right now, you never really know what a company is reporting on. So we're constantly comparing apples to oranges. Carol.
So this is actually a really hard question to answer in some ways, because, you know, the notion of like standardized data requires that everybody reports the same thing. That's kind of the goal, the point. Obviously, there are buckets of data that we can collect, and you know, I'm gonna say, like, you know, those buckets include things like gender, and specifically we should be agreeing to collect gender data around gender, as well as race and ethnicity, and then also where they are in the tiers of the company, like in terms of management or you know, line staff, or however it breaks down, so that we can really get a grasp of what the culture is. And I think that that's a key piece. But I also think that any company that claims that they're diverse and welcoming, but don't actually have the data to prove it, or it's not reflected in their data, you know, they should appreciate the prompt to reconsider why their culture isn't reflected in results, right? So, you know, talking about diversity is really easy, but I'm going to note, like, from the building trades perspective, for instance, we have now a lot of lived experience of the kind of work and effort it takes to really try to deliberately go outside what our comfort zones are, and address diversity and be open to adapting our cultures when necessary. And so these are things that, you know, we are making. I understand, like, the level of effort that goes into it. It is not easy stuff, but we also have to recognize that, again, if it's not showing up, if the results are not showing up in our data, it doesn't matter how much we say that we're diverse, or that we're inclusive, or we're welcoming, and that we're creating equitable systems inside of our companies and our cultures. It's just not going to be real, right? So we have to realize that the rubber hits the road with that data. And even if it's uncomfortable and we feel that doesn't actually show the best light, that light is again, that prompt for that hard change that has to happen. And the changes are hard. We have a lot of experience with that within the construction industry, right? There's been a lot of historical inequity in those spaces. And that's union and non-union. I just want to note that, like, you know, the construction industry is 85% non-union. So that's a piece to remember in terms of, like, how the numbers break down. But we can really do better, and we should be trying. And the fact is that we have to make those efforts in order for it to show up in the data as it gets collected.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. And does anybody else want to weigh in?
Yeah, there are some basic numbers. When you take a look at the EEO1 form that we use now to identify pay data, to determine whether or not we're actually implementing the fair pay law that I wrote in 2015, you got to have that data. And it can be collected in a way so that you aren't comparing minutia, this job versus this job, but in categories. And of course, what we suspect that we will find, and what we have found, is that people of color and women are historically in those lower paying job categories. And from my perspective, the value of this is to basically put a mirror in front of the employer, because a lot of employers, I believe, don't think about it, don't realize that they are, in fact, discriminating. It may not be intentional. We can argue about what's intentional or not, but certainly for many of them, it is kind of a surprise. And where legislation comes in, where enforcement comes in, where companies don't like this, is then we say, hey, this is what's happening. The mirror's in front of you. You gotta believe what's there. It's you prepared the information, it's accurate, and you've got to fix it. It's that part that also, so recognizing the problem and then being willing to fix it are also challenges that come into play. And, you talk about the trades. For years, I've been on the trades because the number of women who are in the trades is woefully inadequate. And then you ask the question, well, why is that? Well, yes, they're paid almost the same, but what's the culture like? Why do women not even think to join, or once they join, they leave? These are the questions too. You have to dig deeper into these companies and come up with sort of what I sometimes refer to as that come to Jesus moment, when you realize that, as you say, those old habits die very hard and are not going to die unless you confront them and make them change.
And you bring up a very good point, Hannah-Beth, about questions that could be asked across the board, even if your company has national or global offices. If you're talking about the cultural aspect through employee feedback, it doesn't matter what state you're in. You're going to get the, employee feedback. Do they feel discriminated against? Do they feel pushed out, or do they not? And it doesn't matter where they live or what their age is, or et cetera. So I like the idea of the buckets that you're talking about that could be collected to measure change across regions.
I do
Andrew,
want to
did you want to? Oh, Carol, go ahead.
Really quickly, I just do want to note that we probably, like, when we're talking about collecting data, we should also, especially around diversity issues, which could include things like sexual orientation and other types of sort of gender identification, we have to be careful not to out people or require them to disclose things that they're not comfortable disclosing. But that's those things, but there should also really be efforts to make sure that we've got goals and benchmarks that do reflect the localities, right? The social and racial makeup of those localities, so that we can get a real accurate snapshot of what that means and what it should mean. So,
you're right, that's so important. And one of the things I like to harp on is the transparency of that data. Like for us as a county government, putting that data out there to the public, it puts pressure on us to actually get better, right? It puts pressure on us to actually do the work. So I think it's immensely important for organizations, specifically government agencies, to be transparent about that data. And, another thing I like to always say is there are subject matter experts, to your point, Carol, who can teach us, right, how to collect that data, specifically around gender fluidity and gender sensitive type issues, right? Like the center, LGBTQ Center out here in San Diego, very resourceful in that space. So don't be afraid as an organization, public or private, to lean into those resources to help us collect that data, to do that work that we need to do.
Yeah, which is why it's so important to have a collaborative effort and allow providers from all directions to lend their expertise. I just want to note that we seem to have lost Barbara, and I'm assuming it was some sort of a technical snafu. I hope she didn't lose power or something, but we are hoping that she'll be able to jump back in, because we definitely want her contributions here. Andrew, you're mentioning the responsibilities as county, and along those lines, do you agree that gender and racial ethnic minority quotas are a necessary tool or not? And does this force employers to compromise on the quality of their hires? Sorry, I can't say that with a straight face, but
yeah, I definitely don't think it forces people to compromise, right, on the quality. I think that goes off the assumption that those pools of candidates will be unqualified, which is absolutely not true. But I also would say that as far as it being a necessary tool, I think it's necessary in some spaces, right? But I also think that we have to be very strategic about how we use those quotas. I think it's very important that we consider that. I like to think about the Rooney Rule in the NFL. They had a Rooney Rule where you had the pool of interview candidates for coaches. You have to have a certain number of diverse candidates, and that led to Mike Tomlin, who's one of the most successful head coaches in the NFL and Pittsburgh Steelers. And, so the assumption that, the quality of candidates will somehow be poor, that's just not true. But I also think that we need to be very strategic about how we use those quotas. I don't think we'll be successful if we say we need to hire 1, 2, 3, or 4 Black individuals, Black people or brown people. I think we need to be strategic about addressing the structures to which these problems are situated in, right? We're talking about county government, because again, you're talking about the structures, you're talking about the hearts and minds of people, you're talking about the systems that have been built and perpetuated racism over time. What are we doing within these specific structures, and whether it's legislated or not, or it's policy at the Board of Supervisors level or city level, what are we doing within these individual structures to address the systemic issues, right? And that's why I go back to the targeted universalism approach, thinking about the universal goal, but understanding that we're situated differently in the structures, and considering the intersectionality of gender, right? And race, when you're talking about people who are in these structures and what they need to be successful. So quotas, absolutely, I think they're necessary in some spaces, but we need to be strategic about how we use those.
Mm-hmm. I just want to take a moment to welcome back Barbara. Thanks for popping back in. I had directed the question to Andrew from the perspective as County of San Diego about the question of quotas. Do you have anything you want to weigh in with?
Well, first of all, sorry, I had some technical difficulties and had to reboot my computer in the world of Zoom. I have no comments right now. I'll wait for the question.
Hannah-Beth.
Yeah, I am wary of quotas per se. They've been found in many instances to be unconstitutional. I think the perception is not a positive one when you create a quota. But I do think that there are basic minimums in various circumstances, because you need to have that reinforcement. You need to have sort of that confidence and perspective and sense of understanding of others who come from a similar situation. Having that cultural sensitivity, if you will, or sophistication, or I think that's very important, and also provides that level of empowerment that I think Carol was talking about, is that when you're in a room and you're the only one who looks like you, it can be very intimidating. I mean, we have to recognize the human aspects of the differences that we have in this world. And what has been, sadly, I think, a lack of sensitivity about that, and holding people to different standards based upon what the majority would look like, without understanding that people come in with different life experiences, different biases, if you will. And I think that that's really what, when we talk about having a room that reflects the diversity and the different life experiences, that's really what we're looking at, and having a sufficient number so that people can maximize their talents, their comfort levels, their contributions to that particular circumstance. And so I think the word quota is a bad word because it has negative connotations that have been generated intentionally by some who have, put a knee on the concept as something negative, creating an adverse response by others. So I think what we talk about is our humanity, and the fact that we need to be able to feel comfortable where we are, and believe that we bring the same value to the table, regardless of what we look like, what we think, who we what God we worship, if you will, what our gender orientation is. That's what our gender is. I mean, these are the things that we should celebrate, and that we have not historically done that. So we need to take steps to acknowledge that and to fix it, to improve it.
Thank you. And before I turn to Carol to weigh in, I just want to add one more dimension to this question. Can quotas, just using that word right now for lack of a different term, can they help employers come to that moment of realization? It's no secret that people gravitate toward other people who look and sound like them. They you know, there's just that sense of identification. So can quotas or anything along the
How about
lines?
if can we call it a critical mass? Let's call it a critical mass of people.
I like that.
You know, but I think Hannah-Beth raised a really good point about the stigma around quotas and what that does to people, right? And organizations, if you ask them to do that, that could put a wall up before you even get to, right, actually bringing people in. And then once those folks are in, now people are trying to get them out because they feel like they're the racial hire, right? Or they're the Black hire, right? That kind of thing. And it might not be successful. And so I think you got to be really careful with that. And I think it could have, so so to answer your question is I don't believe that it could potentially get people to that realization unless they allow themselves to get there, right? So I think you got to be really careful with how we do that, how we approach those.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually, you know, it's I think that having, well, so I'll just note when Prop 16 failed last year and Prop 16 was to amend Prop 209, which would have allowed us to consider, take race and gender and other things like this into consideration. It wasn't going to set any like goal, like no targets or numbers or anything like that. So no quotas, but actually just allow us to consider those things as characteristics that we're looking for in people for hire or for admission to schools or whatever it is. I think it was actually a loss for us, not just losing like the ballot measure, but it was a loss as a tool for people who and companies and legislators and policymakers who really need something that can help us. Like, so for instance, the building trades, when we do labor agreements, a lot of times local hire is something that is a huge factor and component and is a really strong selling point. And specifically in that local hire, we really want policymakers and community folks always want to see us really targeting racial groups or like specific groups of folks who have been historically excluded from whatever opportunities existed in the construction industry. And this is something that it can be really challenging, especially in a place like San Diego, when there isn't a lot of density in any particular geographic location of any particular community. We've got a lot, we're sort of very disparate out here. And especially with the Black community, it's sort of scattered all over and there's no critical mass in one space. So what we've got as a tool is geographic tools. We can use zip codes, we could do targeted hire out of those types of things. But that doesn't actually allow us to really get to the crux of the matter, which is really about trying to identify and recruit in folks from marginalized, historically marginalized and impacted communities that could actually really benefit from these opportunities. And if we were able to find them and recruit them in and you know, identify folks who want those opportunities, that's a huge thing. So part of what we've done to kind of adapt to that, we've done zip code and targeted recruitment and hire in that space, but we've also started doing programming that's place-based, you know, really trying to like create opportunities that are in particular communities that are local to folks. We can't do any type of racial targeting, unfortunately, but it would have been a good tool, I think, to have, because these are the types of opportunity that can actually, you know, facilitate. It's not necessarily always forcing. Sometimes it's just about facilitating, and having tools that facilitate would have been helpful. But I think it's one of those. I agree with Andrew that I still remember from back in the 80s and 90s when we talked about racial hires and we talked about like, oh, that student got into that school because of affirmative action. And there was it definitely sort of was an opportunity for people to like kind of double down on their biases, if that makes sense. But also it was an opportunity, and it was hard, I'm sure, for the folks who are coming in those seats to kind of break down barriers with the folks in those spaces already, the people who were already dominating those spaces, as it were, the populations and communities that are dominating those spaces, to kind of get a foot in the door and also start to change people's perspectives and experiences, because lived experience trumps just about everything else. And so if you've got lived experience that says, oh, that woman is actually really qualified for this job, I never would have thought it, or oh, that, you know, that that Black person or that brown person, same thing. These are the things that can actually start to really shift culture in a powerful way. And that's what we really need as a broader society, I think, when it comes to looking for equity in workplaces.
Thank you so much for that perspective, for all of your perspectives. Barbara, I just was curious from the tech perspective, do you have comments?
So I'll just say from the tech perspective, so biotech has lots of women in senior roles, a lot of women get PhDs in the biosciences, and that's really a precursor for many companies to be able to go into a management position. Tech, less so. And as we know, people of color are very much underrepresented in both tech and biotech in San Diego, and I'm assuming around the world. And I think the companies are starting to wake up and realize that they're missing out on a lot of really smart people out there, and that they've got to play a role in developing the pipeline. And there's a wonderful program at UCSD started by Dr. Gentry Patrick, who's a neuroscientist. He grew up in Watts. He went to Harvard. I mean, he's doing like world-class research. And in his spare time, he started a program that's was focused on San Diego high school students of color whose parents had not gone to college, who were interested in science, and getting them into UCSD and mentoring them to keep them engaged in science. And this program is now expanding to other campuses. And I think no one's talking about quotas or numbers. It's really, we need these people. We need them desperately. There's a shortage of skilled talent in tech and biotech today. And we need, everybody to be able to access these jobs.
Thank you, Barbara. All of everything that you've all said today really leads us to this last question. This is the brainstorming part, and I have a feeling a lot of points that you make are going to come into this. Let's say this part of the panel discussion was the launch of an actual roundtable to hash out a collaborative plan just for the next 3 years. I mean, let's be realistic. It's hard enough to think 6 months ahead. But if we're talking on the regional level, let's say we want to set some milestones for 3 years out. What's the first one you think we should hope to achieve, and by when? Hannah-Beth, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I think, as I had mentioned earlier, you have to get everybody to the table and tell them what your goal is. Mm-hmm. What is it you want to accomplish? And I think that the first step, and I think it was Barbara, somebody mentioned it in this discussion, is you got to collect accurate and complete data. You got to know what you're talking about. Yeah. And data, I like to think numbers don't lie, but people interpret numbers differently. But if you can get people to see the data, you collect it and you see it, it gives you a starting point so that you can then develop effective and real solutions. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that's the critical step, is you got to, what is it your goal is? And I think that's always very important, because otherwise you never get into a conversation that goes in a linear direction. So it's important that you identify that, and then you start collecting the data so that you're all looking at essentially the same problem. This is the problem. You will find, I suspect, for example, on the pay equity issue, that you will find that your people of color, women and people of color, are at the low end of the job categories of your company. That we've already seen that. We got to continue taking a look. And then as you rise up in the different categories, suddenly it's almost all white men in the higher echelons. Mm-hmm. That needs to be acknowledged before you can solve it. And so that's what I think you need to do.
Thank you. And I do want to just clarify for a moment, we talk about women because they are the largest marginalized population within every group, and improving things for women within that group improves things for everybody else within that group, whereas it doesn't work the other way around. Barbara, how about you next?
Yeah, so I come out of the tech world. I love data. I love what Hannah-Beth said about collecting the data. And a few years ago, there was a particularly meaningful 60 Minutes episode on Salesforce.com with the CEO, Mark Benioff. And he was sure that women and men in the company who were doing like job A were paid the same. People who were doing job B, men and women, were paid the same. They did an internal study and they found out that wasn't the case at all. That in fact, for people who were doing similar jobs, women were paid less than men. Now, Salesforce is a giant company. They could take steps to remedy that quickly. It wasn't going to impact their bottom line significantly. But over time, of course, first of all, I'd love to go back and see how Salesforce is doing now, what it's done to the company culture, how it's impacted recruiting and retention. And I'd like to start with, Hannah's focus on data with pay equity. Is person A, whether it's a man, a woman, or a transgender person, being paid the same to do job A or job B? Then look at sort of different levels of the company and in terms of what kinds of, who is filling what positions, are women and men equal in the C-suite, et cetera. And that's where I would like to start. And I think within 3 years, you could get some meaningful data and perhaps even some results that if you are moving toward equity, it really is going to help your company's bottom line.
Thank you, Barbara. Andrew?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with what Hannah-Beth and Barbara were saying. And the data piece is critical, right? And doing that level of data analysis, but also within the different structures and systems that exist, I think is critically important, right? When you're thinking about whether it's the government structures, or you're thinking about the unions, or you're thinking about the trades, you're thinking about what is the data telling us about what's happening within those structures that persist. But also thinking about the intersectionality. I know you mentioned doing the data analysis, but again, I keep going back to the intersectionality within that data, right? So you're thinking about the gender, but you're thinking about the different races within that gender and the levels of oppression and discrimination that happens. I think those are critically important, but the data analysis and then coming together with a structure and a plan. And then lastly, co-creating the goal. I know Hannah-Beth, you talked about developing that goal. I think it's also critically important to co-create that goal with the people who it's going to impact, right? With the general public, like have those community engagement sessions around what this really means for the people who've been excluded from the job market, right? For the people who've gone to those interviews or who've been let go because of certain things that happen in organizations. How do you co-create that goal, universal goal, right? And then move that forward.
Thank you, Andrew. Carol.
Yeah, I actually just want to kind of piggyback off of what Andrew just said. And also this is about what Hannah-Beth was saying when we're talking about building the buy-in from the organizations themselves and the leaders of those organizations is so critical, because you can sometimes, if you think about, for instance, like I was thinking, what are the steps that we would need? We need data, obviously. That's the first thing. If you can't fix a problem that you can't identify, right? So that's the first piece. But beyond that, like what are the tools that we would actually put into place to try to address those issues? And some of it's training in terms of pre-existing bias trainings, or all these types of things that we sometimes already do, right? So if you think about, for instance, how people approach sexual harassment training in their workplace, it's been legislated, we all do it, we all think it's like ridiculous and awful, right? And part of it is that on the one hand, it can be done, it might be the training itself, is it the quality of the training and the trainer and whether or not they're good at delivering the training and getting the kind of buy-in from the work, whoever they're presenting to. But it's also about getting buy-in from those organizations, from the businesses, from the leaders of those groups, because it's really sometimes a top-down culture. You're right that if you change the circumstances and conditions for the people who are at the bottom, who are the women in these groups, right? All these various groups. So women of color largely are the ones who are most impacted with inequities in terms of all of this kind of discrimination. So if you improve things for them, everybody else is doing good. Like we can all agree about that. But the improvement for them has to come with pressure from the top. Like the top has to decide and buy in that that's what they want to achieve. So I think that when we're thinking about these types of plans, like beyond getting the data, we also have to start to think about how do we actually get buy-in from leadership to be able to create these changes in a meaningful way that's going to be lasting and systemic and will actually address policies and procedures, which is what Andrew was getting at when he's talking about, it's not just about making sure that the metrics are aligned, it's about creating culture shift and change. And you've got to really be willing to lean into that. And it's, you need the buy-in from the leadership to get that to happen.
I'm just going to kind of sum up what I'm hearing. It sounds like within the first 3 years, we should collect data and kind of as a companion to what you're all saying, identify the stakeholder groups and then convene them and make sure that we have buy-in from all the key stakeholder groups so that we can then agree on the goals and then I guess priorities too. Then from there, the rest is easy, right?
I mean, we might actually need public opinion campaigns, interestingly,
Yeah.
if you think about it, right? These are the types of things that have to happen where the broader society as a whole decides, you know, these are things that are important to us. These are our values, and we want these values to be embodied in our institutions, whether there are businesses, whether there are unions, whether there are government agencies, all of it. So, you know, I think that's the issue there.
And I agree so much with you, Carol. I think we have to co-create that space, right? And with community and with the stakeholders who are involved, you know, because that's how you get that buy-in, is you build it with them, right? You build that piece of legislation or you build that project or that program with the community folks who are going to be taking advantage of what that program is.
And part of that is accountability. You want public buy-in. I mean, if we don't put pressure on these businesses, it's not going to happen unless A, employees aren't coming back to work, or B, they can't sell their product, or C, they've been outed as a company that does X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's a business, they're business profit driven. And we have to recognize that that's the nature of capitalism. And we have to find ways that will incentivize their, if you will, taking a broader look at their duties and responsibilities to include more than just the bottom line. And I think that's an important element that we sometimes ignore. Their goal is to make money. And that is, and you talk to the CEOs and what have you, that's what they tell you. My fiduciary duty is to my shareholders. And unless and until companies start shifting a little bit, we're starting to see a little bit with, ESL, companies that are committed to planet as well as profit, and that they're being responded to very favorably by the public that also recognizes the importance of prioritizing our environment and what have you. Unless we can do that, we're not going to get them to come willingly. There has to be public pressure, there has to be other motivation, and there has to be a reward for them at the end of the road.
I just want to note, Hannah-Beth, you're absolutely right. Unions have a lot of experience knowing that we can't get them to come willingly. So, there's a reason that unions exist. Mm-hmm.
Well, you all came to this panel knowing what you were getting into. Let me just ask you real quick. Do you believe that this kind of a collaborative effort can be done on a regional level? Let's just say on a regional level.
Well, yes, absolutely. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't have spent all those years in Sacramento. But it can be done. A lot of this, again, culture shifting takes time. It takes pressure. It takes, I know with the unions really trying to push hard on certain priorities for their membership. If the public would step forward and recognize that it has a voice, that it is, we talk with our dollars, with our feet. And the young people today in particular, being so concerned about climate change and all, they are very much talking, both with a bullhorn and with their pocketbooks. And this is really critically important. But there also has to be incentive, whether we talk about carrots or sticks, from the powers that be that make the policy that are theoretically supposed to be running the country and reflecting the values of the people involved, as citizens of that country or that community, if you will. If you want to go to a sort of more granular level, San Diego has some very strong priorities for its community that might be a little bit different than Eureka or, I think the state of Jefferson. I mean, but these are things that we really need to focus on, to recognize and to implement.
Barbara, did you have a comment? Oh, was it Carol?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I agree with Hannah-Beth that, we have to believe that these things are possible. If we're not willing to believe that these things are possible, then there's no fuel for the actions that will have to take place to drive the changes that we're seeking. So I do believe that it's possible, but I also am completely clear-eyed about how much work it will take to get us there.
Yeah, and I just piggyback on that. I think it's also critical for people to realize that it's important, right? And because that's what's going to put the momentum behind actually doing all that work, right? Because there's so much other work that needs to be done and that people are doing their day-to-day jobs. But once you realize, or you rise it to the level where it's just as important as the work that you do every day, that's when the change can start to happen, right? Because too often I've seen we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's this thing on the side. This is one thing we want to do. It's important, but it's not necessarily as important as the bottom line, as you said, Hannah-Beth. But once you can get it to that point, that's when I think change will start happening.
I love what Andrew said about everybody needing to realize it's important. At the end of the day, talent is what drives every company, and the talent goes home every night and hopefully comes back in the morning. And this is going to be an imperative for companies if they're going, and this has been, I'm like a broken record, the companies that figure this out are going to have a leg up on recruiting and retaining the best.
Yeah.
That will lead to a better bottom line. So.
Right. It's win-win. Well, I'm glad to hear you all say that, because this collaborative effort is the reason the Kim Center exists. So I'm definitely glad to know that we have advocates and supporters and agreeers from all areas. Our goal is to turn San Diego into a regional model, to prove that a region can make change together and then replicate that throughout the country. In the process, we're probably going to, some people are not going to be happy. Is it worth it to draw the line, just to say, look, we have to draw the line somewhere? Andrew, what do you think?
Oh, it's absolutely worth it. It's absolutely, you're not going to make everybody happy, and this, again, when you're talking about equity, it's a tough conversation to go back to where we started, to define equity and get people on the same page about what that means. And then the work that needs to happen to try to achieve that. And but I absolutely agree.
And Barbara, you mentioned, you repeatedly, thank you for really emphasizing the bottom line advantages. So there is long-term benefit, even for short-term pain.
Yeah. And I wrote a recent column for the Union Tribune about B corporations, which acknowledge in their charter that they are in existence for more than shareholder profit. So they acknowledge that right up front. And there are B corporations that are raising tens of millions of venture capital that are going. Warby Parker, the eyeglass company, which recently went public, is a B corporation. We have about 25 B corporations in San Diego County, including some very successful ones, and they see this as part of their business.
Well, I didn't want to say it previously, but I'm a big believer in B Corps. Okay. In my district, where I represented Santa Barbara and Ventura counties, there's a company called Patagonia, which was the first B Corp, and their policies: people, planet, profits. Mm-hmm. If we could incorporate that, life would be so much easier. But the resistance to that, of course, is rather enormous. But I'm excited to hear that there are so many in San Diego now. You know, if we do recognize our responsibility extends beyond the profit of our shareholders to the future of our planet, to improving the quality of life for everyone, that will make a substantial and meaningful difference. So that's what I hope for when you ask, Hei-ock, is it worth it? If that's where we can go, if that's the direction we're headed, it's absolutely worth it.
Thank you, Hannah-Beth. Carol, you want to close us out?
Well, I'm going to agree with my fellow panelists that yes, it's worth it. You know, this is how we actually get to a place where our societies and our economies are healthy and sustainable. And frankly, you know, Hannah-Beth is right about people, planets, profits, et cetera. You know, we've got to be willing to shift away from emphasizing a shareholder economy so much and really focus and think about stakeholder economies, you know, which actually allow us to be more inclusive, be more holistic in our approach to what we see as success, and really start to get a better sense of what it means for us all to do okay together. And you know, at the end of the day, if we're not actually taking care of folks in the workplace by making sure they have equitable conditions and that they're getting hired and they're able to make a living, we pay for it on the back end, you know, with intervention costs, which are often much higher than prevention costs. So, you know, it only makes sense for all of us as a society to decide that this is the way we should come at it and approach it. And, you know, realize that while change is scary and while there are costs, at least to some upfront, overall, it'll be a win-win-win where everybody benefits. And that's the goal, and it should always be the goal.
Thank you all so much. And we're honored to have this amazing brain trust here. And I'm very happy to be able to say that this is the end of a mini-series, but really the beginning of the critical conversations that need to come and will come. So thanks. With that, I'll thank also our audience for joining us for this episode of Uniting for Workplace Parity. We hope you'll like and share this post, add your questions or comments or thoughts in the comments, and look for announcements for our next mini-series starting in January of 2022. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.